When most people hear the words serial killer, certain names immediately come to mind: Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy, the Zodiac Killer. For decades, these names have become symbols of some of the most disturbing crimes in American history. Books have been written about them, movies have been made, documentaries continue to attract millions of viewers. But here's the question very few people ask: did serial killers disappear? Or are they still out there? Hollywood often makes it seem as though serial killers belong to another era, a dark chapter from the 70s and 80s. According to criminal investigators, behavioral scientists, and the FBI, serial murder has not disappeared, but it has changed. Today, we're separating myth from reality. We'll examine America's most infamous serial killers. We'll look at why serial murder exploded during the late 20th century. We'll explore how modern forensic science has transformed homicide investigations. And finally, we'll answer one of the most frequently asked questions in criminal justice: how many serial killers are believed to be active today? I'm Kim, and welcome back to Crime Stats Daily. Let's go. To understand where we are today, we first have to understand where we've been. America has experienced hundreds of documented serial murder investigations over the past century. And while every case is unique, a handful of offenders change criminal investigations forever. Ted Bundy murdered at least 30 young women across several states during the 1970s. His ability to move from one jurisdiction to another exposed serious communication gaps between police agencies. John Wayne Gacy shocked investigators when 33 victims were discovered on his property outside Chicago. His case challenged the belief that dangerous offenders always appeared suspicious to those people around them. Jeffrey Dahmer murdered 17 young men over more than a decade. His crimes highlighted the importance of taking missing persons reports seriously, especially involving victims from marginalized communities. Richard Ramirez, known as the Night Stalker, spread fear throughout Southern California because his victims appeared to have little in common. Investigators struggled to identify a consistent pattern before he was eventually captured. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, avoided arrest for years before advances in DNA technology finally linked him to multiple murders. Dennis Rader, better known as BTK, remained unidentified for more than 30 years before digital forensics evidence ultimately exposed him. And perhaps the most surprising of all, Samuel Little. He confessed to 93 murders committed over several decades. The FBI has confirmed 50 of those murders, making him the most prolific confirmed serial killer in American history. Some of these offenders became household names. Others remained virtually unknown until years after their crimes. But together, they transformed the way law enforcement investigates serial homicide. Now, before we go any further, it's important to understand what investigators actually mean when they use the term serial killer. Many people mistakenly use the term serial killer, spree killer, and mass murderer interchangeably. But law enforcement makes important distinctions. A mass murderer kills multiple victims during a single event. A spree killer commits multiple murders over a short period without a meaningful break between attacks. A serial killer is someone who commits two or more murders in separate events, with what investigators call a cooling off period between them. That cooling off period may last days, weeks, months, or even years. This distinction is important because it reflects a pattern of repeated behavior rather than a single outburst of violence. Now, one additional point often surprises people. For many years, the public believed a serial killer had to murder at least 3 victims. Today, the FBI defines serial murder as 2 or more murders committed by the same offender in separate events, allowing investigators to identify possible serial offenders earlier in an investigation. Now, if you grew up in the 1970s or the 80s, you probably remember hearing about serial killers with alarming frequency. That wasn't simply media attention. Researchers have found that serial murder reached its highest levels during those decades before beginning a steady decline. But why? Did something suddenly make people more violent? Or was something else happening? The answer isn't simple. Several changes in American society came together at exactly the right, or perhaps the wrong time. Police departments often worked independently. DNA testing didn't exist. Computers were pretty rare. Information was stored on paper. People traveled more frequently across the country, and offenders could move from one jurisdiction to another without investigators realizing they were searching for the same person. In other words, many serial killers were operating in an era where staying anonymous was far easier than it is today. So, why did America experience what many criminologists describe as a golden age of serial killers? There wasn't one single cause. Instead, several major changes in American society created opportunities that offenders were able to exploit. First, technology simply wasn't available. Police departments relied almost entirely on paper files. There were no national computer databases, no instant record searches, certainly no surveillance cameras on nearly every street corner, no smartphones recording locations. If investigators in one state were looking for a suspect, detectives hundreds of miles away often had no idea they were investigating someone using the same methods. Communication was slow, information was fragmented, and those gaps sometimes allowed offenders to continue killing for years before anyone realized the crimes were connected. America itself was changing as well. The interstate highway system made long distance travel easier than ever before. An offender could commit a crime in one state and disappear into another before investigators even knew who they were. Many victims were also reported missing much later than they would be today. Some lived alone, some were traveling, others belonged to communities where disappearances did not always receive immediate attention. Every day that passed before a missing person investigation began gave offenders more time to avoid detection. These circumstances didn't create serial killers, but they did make it easier for some offenders to remain hidden for a very long time. Now let's fast forward to today. The investigative landscape looks completely different. Modern offenders leave behind far more evidence than they often realize. Every text, every message, every cell phone signal, every surveillance camera, every electronic purchase, every vehicle passing a license plate reader, has the potential to become evidence. Perhaps the greatest breakthrough has been DNA. When DNA testing became widely available, it revolutionized criminal investigation. Cases that had gone unsolved for decades suddenly had new possibilities. Evidence collected years earlier could now identify offenders with extraordinary precision. Today, investigators can often solve crimes using biological evidence that was impossible to analyze when the crime originally occurred. Another remarkable advancement is genetic genealogy. Instead of identifying the offender directly, investigators compare crime scene DNA to publicly available family DNA databases by identifying distant relatives and building family trees. Detectives can narrow their search until they identify a likely suspect. Several notorious cold cases have now been solved using this approach, proving that even decades old evidence can still bring answers to victims' families. Technology hasn't eliminated violent crime, it has dramatically reduced an offender's ability to remain anonymous. Now, modern investigators also depend on something that didn't exist decades ago: information sharing. One of the FBI's most valuable investigative resources is called the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, or ViCAP. Its mission is pretty straightforward: help investigators recognize patterns that might otherwise go unnoticed. Imagine detectives in, say, Arizona investigating a homicide. Meanwhile, investigators in Nevada are working a similar case, and another police department in New Mexico is looking into a third. At first glance, these crimes might appear unrelated: different cities, different victims, different investigators. But when details from each case are entered into ViCAP, similarities may begin to emerge: victim characteristics, crime scene behavior, methods used by the offender. Those shared details can reveal that multiple jurisdictions may actually be searching for the same individual. No computer solves the case by itself. Detectives still perform the difficult investigative work required, but databases like ViCAP make it far easier to recognize patterns that once might have remained hidden for years. Now, one of the most remarkable changes in criminal investigations is that time is no longer the protection it once was. For decades, investigators often believed that if a murder remained unsolved for 20 or 30 years, it might never be solved. Today, that assumption is changing. Advances in forensic science continue to breathe new life into cold cases. Old evidence is being re-examined using technology that simply didn't exist when those crimes occurred. DNA can identify offenders decades later. Fingerprints can be compared against expanded databases. Digital records provide new investigative leads. Even witness interviews are revisited with fresh perspectives. And families who waited years, sometimes decades, for answers are finally learning what happened to their loved ones. Not every cold case is solved, but many are. Every successful investigation sends an important message. No matter how much time has passed, justice can be served. Now, We've come to the question that really inspired this episode. How many serial killers are active in America today? And the honest answer is no one knows. That may sound surprising. It's actually the only answer supported by the evidence. Think about it this way. A serial killer who has not been identified isn't counted in any official database as an active serial killer. Investigators may know there are unsolved murders, and they may suspect that several cases are connected, but until enough evidence links crimes to a single offender, there is no way to know with certainty that a serial killer is responsible. Over the years, some criminologists and former investigators have suggested there may be between 25 and 50 active serial killers operating in the U.S. at any given time. That estimate has been widely repeated in books, documentaries, and news reports. However, it is important to understand that this is an estimate, not an official FBI statistic. The FBI has consistently stated that it cannot determine an exact number because unidentified offenders are, by definition, unknown. What investigators do know is that serial murder represents only a very small percentage of all homicides committed each year, compared to the peak decades of the 1970s and 1980s. Serial homicide appears to be significantly less common today. Now, one reason investigators remain vigilant is that some offenders continue to travel. The FBI created the Highway Serial Killings Initiative to help identify violent offenders who may commit crimes across multiple jurisdictions. The program focuses on identifying patterns involving victims whose bodies are found near major highways. It's important to understand what this initiative is and what it is not. It does not suggest that truck drivers, travelers, or people who use the interstate system are generally dangerous. In fact, the overwhelming majority are law-abiding citizens. Instead, investigators recognize that offenders who travel long distances may leave victims in different jurisdictions, making it harder for local agencies to recognize a pattern. By combining information from multiple investigations, law enforcement has improved its ability to identify cases that may be connected. And the goal is simple: share information early, recognize patterns faster, stop offenders before more lives are lost. Now, popular movies and television have created many myths about serial killers. So let's separate fact from fiction, or fact from myths. So let's look at one myth. All serial killers are criminal masterminds. The fact is, many are identified through careful police work, forensic science, and tips from the public. Another myth: serial killers always target strangers. The fact is, while many do, some target acquaintances, family members, or people within their own communities. Another myth: serial killers are becoming more common. The fact is, available research suggests completely the opposite. Known serial homicide cases have declined significantly since their peak several decades ago. Now it's time for our crime stats spotlight. Here are 5 numbers to remember from today's episode. Let's look at number 1. The FBI defines serial murder as 2 or more murders committed by the same offender in separate events. Number 2, researchers generally agree that the serial homicide investigations peaked during the 1980s. Number 3, Samuel Little is the most prolific confirmed serial killer in U.S. history, with 50 confirmed victims. Number 4, modern DNA and forensic technology have helped solve many cold cases that once seemed impossible to close. And number 5, no one knows exactly how many active serial killers exist today. Any number you hear is simply an estimate, and it's not a confirmed count. Now, stories about serial killers often capture our attention because they seem almost impossible to understand. They remind us that extraordinary violence can sometimes hide behind ordinary appearances. But this episode is about more than infamous criminals. It's about progress. Over the past several decades, law enforcement has transformed the way violent crimes are investigated. DNA technology, national databases, behavioral analysis, improved communications between agencies, advances in forensic science have made it increasingly difficult for offenders to escape justice. Will serial murder ever disappear completely? No one can say, but investigators today have more tools, knowledge, and more cooperation than at any point in history. Every solved case brings answers to families. Every advancement in forensic science gives investigators another opportunity to identify someone who once believed they would never be caught. And every lesson learned helps prevent future victims. Guys, thank you for joining me for another episode of Crime Stats Daily. If you found today's episode informative, please consider following, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who you know that enjoys learning about crime through facts and data, not fear. I'm Kim. Thanks for watching. Stay informed, stay aware, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next video.